This collection features 4 supernatural weird tales. One of them is written by Manly Wade Wellman. I added timestamp for each story in the video description. Have a good one. The Liers in Wait by Manly Wade Wellman. Weird Tales, November 1941. Here lies our sovereign Lord the King, whose word no man relies on, who never said a foolish thing, nor ever did a wise one. Proffered epitaph on Charles II. John Wilmot, Earl of Rochester, 1647 to 1680. Yes, Jack Wilmot wrote so concerning me, and rallied me, saying these lines he would cut upon my monument. And now he is dead at 33, while I live at 50, none so merry a monarch as folks deem me. Jack's verse makes me out a coxcomb, but he knew me not in my youth. He was but 4, and sucking sugar plums, when his father and I were fugitives after Worcester. Judge from this story, if he rhymes the truth of me. I think it was then, with the rain soaking my wretched borrowed clothes, and the heavy tight plough shoes rubbing my feet all to blisters, that I first knew consciously how misery may come to kings as to vagabonds. Egad, I was turned the second before I had well been the first, trying to think of other things than my present sorry state among the dripping trees of spring coppice. I could but remember sorrier things still. Chiefly came to mind the Worcester fight, that had been rather a cutting down of my poor men like barley, and Cromwell's Ironside troopers the reapers. How could so much ill luck befall? Lauderdale's bold folly, that wasted our best men in a charge. The mazed silence of Leslie's Scots horse, the first of their blood I ever heard of before or since who refused battle. I remembered too, as a sick dream, how I charged with a few faithful at a troop of parliamentarian horse said to be Cromwell's own guard. I had cut down a mailed rider with a pale face like the winter moon, and rode back dragging one of my own, wounded sore, across my saddle-bow. He had died there, crying to me, "God save your most sacred majesty," and now I had need of God to save me. More things than Cromwell's wit and might went into this disaster, I told myself in the rain, nor knew how true I spoke. After the battle, the retreat. Had it been only last night, Leslie's horsemen, who had refused to follow me toward Cromwell, had dogged me so close, fleeing him, I was at pains to scatter and so avoid them. Late we had paused, my gentleman and I, at a manor of white ladies. There we agreed to divide and flee in disguise. With try-help of 2 faithful yokels named Penderel, I cut my long curls with a knife and crammed my big body into coarse garments, grey cloth breeches, a leathern doublet, a green jump coat, while that my friends smeared my face and hands with chimney soot. Then farewells, and I gave each gentleman a keepsake, a ribbon, a buckle, a watch, and so forward. I remembered too my image in a mirror, and it was most unkingly a towering, swarthy young man, ill-clad, ill-faced. One of the staunch Penderels bade me name myself, and I chose to be called Will Jones, a wandering woodcutter. Will Jones. 'Twas an easy name and comfortable. For the nonce I was happier with it than with Charles Stuart, England's king and son of that other Charles who had died by Cromwell's axe. I was heir to bitter sorrow and trouble and mystery, in my youth lost and hunted and friendless as any strong thief. The rain was steady and weary. I tried to ask myself what I did here in spring coppice. It had been necessary to hide the day out and travel by night, but whose thought was it to choose this dim, sorrowful wood? Richard Penderel had said that no rain fell elsewhere. Perhaps that was well, since Ironsides might forbear to seek me in such sorry bogs, but meanwhile I shivered and sighed, and wished myself a newt. The trees, what I could see, were broad oaks with some fir and larch, and the ground grew high with bracken reddened by September's first chill. Musing thus, I heard a right ill sound, horses' hoofs. I threw myself half downways among some larch scrub, peering out through the clumpy leaves. My right hand clutched the axe I carried as part of my masquerade. Beyond was a lane, and along it, one by one, rode enemy, a troop of Cromwell's horse, hard fellows and ready-seeming, with breasts and caps of iron. The stared right and left searchingly. The bright, bitter eyes of their officer seemed to strike through my hiding like a pike point. I clutched my axe the tighter, and swore on my soul that, if found, I would the fighting, a better death after all than my poor father's. But they rode past, and out of sight. I sat up, and wiped muck from my long nose. "I'm free yet," I told myself. "One day, please our Lord, I shall sit on the throne that is mine. Then shall I seek out these iron sides and feed fat the gallows at Tyburn, the block at the Tower." For I was young and cruel then, as now I am old and mellow. Religion perplexed and irked me. I could not understand, or like Cromwell's praise God men of war, whose faces were as sharp and merciless as, alas, their swords. "I'll give them texts to quote," I vowed. "I have heard their canting war cries, smite and spare not. They shall learn how it is to be smitten and spared not." For the moment, I felt as if vengeance were already mine, my house restored to power, my adversaries chained and delivered into my hand. Then I turned to cooler thoughts, and chiefly that I had best seek a hiding less handy to that trail through the trees. The thought was like sudden memory, as if indeed I knew the coppice and where best to go. For I mind me how I rose from among the larches, turned on the heel of one pinching shoe, and struck through a belt of young spruce, as though I were indeed a woodcutter, seeking by familiar ways the door of mine own hut. So confidently did I stride that I blundered, or did I, into a thorny vine that hung down from a long oak limb. It fastened upon my sleeve like urging fingers. "Nay, friend," I said to it, trying to be gay, "hold me not here in the wet," and I twitched away. That was one more matter about spring coppice that seemed strange and not over-canny, as also the rain, the gloom, my sudden desire to travel toward its heart. Yet, as you shall see here, these things were strange only in their basic cause. But I forego the tale. "So cometh Will Jones to his proper home," quoth a verse, axe on shoulder. Speaking thus merrily, I came upon another lane, but narrower than that on which the horseman had ridden. This ran ankle-deep in mire, and I remember how the damp, soaking into my shoes, soothed those plaguey blisters. I followed the way for some score of paces, and meseemed that the rain was heaviest here, like a curtain before some hidden thing. Then I came into a cleared space, with no trees nor bush, nor even grass upon the bald earth. In its centre, wreathed with rainy mists, a house. I paused, just within shelter of the leaves. What, I wondered, has my new magic of being a woodcutter conjured up a woodcutter's shelter? But this house was no honest workman's place. That much I saw with but half an eye. Conjured up it might well have been, and most foully. I gazed at it without savour, and saw that it was not large, but lean and high-looking by reason of the steep pitch of its roof. That roof's thatch was so wet and foul that it seemed all of one drooping substance, like the cap of a dark toadstool. The walls, too, were damp, being of clay daub, spread upon a framework of wattles. It had one door, and that a mighty thick heavy one, of a single dark plank that hung upon heavy rusty hinges. One window it had, too, through which gleamed some sort of light, but instead of glass, the window was filled with something like thin scraped rawhide, so that light could come through, but not the shape of things within. And so I knew not what was in that house, nor at the time had I any conscious lust to find out. I say, no conscious lust, for it was unconsciously that I drifted idly forth from the screen of wet leaves, gained and moved along a little hard-packed path between bracken clumps, That path led to the door, and I found myself standing before it, while through the skinned-over window, inches away, I heard noises. Noises, I call them, for at first I could not think they were voices. Several soft hummings or purrings came to my ears, from what source I knew not. Finally, though, actual words high and raspy. We who keep the commandment love the law. Moloch, Lucifer, Baltai Mor, Anector, Somiator, sleep ye not. Compel ye that the man approach. It had the sound of a prayer, and yet I recognized but one of the names called Lucifer. Tutors, parsons, my late unhappy allies, Die Scots Covenanters, had used the name often fearfully. Prayer within that ugly, lean house went up, or down, belike, to the fallen sun of the morning. I stood against the door, pondering. My grandsire, King James, had believed and feared such folks' pretense. My father, who was King Charles before me, was pleased to doubt and be merciful, pardoning many accused witches and sorcerers. As for me, my short life had held scant leisure to decide such a matter. While I waited in the fine misty rain on the threshold, the high voice spoke again. "Drive him to us! Drive him to us! Drive him to us!" Silence within, and you may be sure silence without. A new voice, younger and thinner, made itself heard. "Naught comes to us." "Respect the promises of our masters," replied the first. "What says the book?" And yet a new voice, this time soft and a woman's. "Let the door be opened and the wayfarer be plucked in." I swear that I had not the least impulse to retreat, even to step aside. 'Twas as if all my life depended on knowing more. As I stood, ears aprick like any cat's, the door creaked inward by 3 inches. An arm in a dark sleeve shot out, and fingers as lean and clutching as thorn twigs fastened on the front of my jump coat. "I have him safe," rasped the high voice that had prayed. A moment later, I was drawn inside, before I could ask the reason. There was one room to the house, and it stank of burning weeds. There were no chairs or other furniture, and no fireplace. But in the center of the tamped clay floor burned an open fire, whose rank smoke climbed to a hole at the roof's peak. Around this fire was drawn a circle in white chalk, and around the circle a star in red. Close outside the star were the 3 whose voices I had heard. Mine eyes lighted first on she who held the book. Young she was and dainty. She sat on the floor, her feet drawn under her full skirt of black stuff. Above a white collar of Dutch style, her face was round, and at the same time fine and fair, with a short red mouth and blue eyes like the clean sea. Her hair, under a white cap, was as yellow as corn. She held in her slim white hands a thick book, whose cover looked to be grown over with dark hair, like the hide of a Galloway bull. Her eyes held mine for 2 trices, then I looked beyond her to another seated person. He was small enough to be a child, but the narrow bright eyes in his thin face were older than the oldest I had seen, and the hands clasped around his bony knees were rough and sinewy, with large sore-seeming joints. His hair was scanty, and eke his eyebrows. His neck showed swollen painfully. It is odd that my last look was for him who had drawn me in. He was tall, almost as myself, and grizzled hair fell on the shoulders of his velvet doublet. One claw still clapped hold of me, and his face, a foot from mine, was as dark and bloodless as earth. Its lips were loose, its quivering nose broken. The eyes, cold and wide as a frog's, were as steady as gun muzzles. He kicked the door shut and let me go. "Name yourself," he rasped at me. "If you be not he whom we seek." "I am Will Jones, a poor woodcutter," I told him. Murmured the wench with the book. "Belike the youngest of 7 sons, sent forth by a cruel step to meet o seek fortune in the world. So runs the fairy tale, and we want none such. Your true name, sirrah." I told her roundly that she was insolent, but she only smiled. And I never saw a fairer than she, not in all the courts of Europe. not even sweet Nell Gwyn. After many years I can see her eyes, a little slanting and a little hungry. Even when I was so young, women feared me, but this one did not. His word shall not need, spoke the thin young old fellow by the fire. Am I not here to make him prove himself? He lifted his face so that the fire brightened it, and I saw hot red blotches thereon. True, agreed the grizzled man. Sirrah, whether you be Will Jones the woodman or Charles Stuart the king, have you no mercy on poor Dickon yonder? If 'twould ease his ail, would you not touch him? That was a sneer, but I looked closer at the thin fellow called Dickon, and made sure that he was indeed sick and sorry. His face grew full of hope, turning up to me. I stepped closer to him. Why, with all my heart, if 'twill serve, I replied. Wear the star and circle, step not within the star and circle, cautioned the wench, but I came not near those marks. Standing beside and above Dickon, I felt his brow, and felt that it was fevered. A hot humour is in your blood, friend, I said to him, and touched the swelling on his neck. But had there been a swelling there? I touched it, but 'twas suddenly gone, like a furtive mouse under my finger. Dickon's neck looked lean and healthy. His face smiled, and from it had fled the red blotches. He gave a cry and sprang to his feet. "'Tis past, 'tis past," he howled. "I am whole again." But the eyes of his comrades were for me. Only a king could have done so, quoth the older man. "Young sir, I do take you truly for Charles Stuart. At your touch, Dickon was healed of the king's evil." I folded my arms, as if I must keep my hands from doing more strangeness. I had heard, too, of that old legend of the Stuarts without deeming myself concerned. Yet, here it had befallen. Dickon had suffered from the king's evil, which learned doctors call scrofula. My touch had driven it from his thin body. He danced and quivered with the joy of health, but his fellows looked at me as though I had betrayed myself by sin. "It is indeed the king," said the girl, also rising to her feet. "No," I made shift to say. "I am but poor Will Jones," and I wondered where I had let fall my axe. Will Jones, a woodcutter. "Yours to command, Will Jones," mocked the grizzled man. "My name is Valois Pembrew, erst a schoolmaster. My daughter Regan," and he flourished one of his talons at the wench. "Dickon, our kinsman and servitor, you know already well enough to heal him. For our profession, we are. He seemed to have said too much, and his daughter came to his rescue. "We are liars in wait," she said. "True, liars in wait," repeated Pembrew, glad of the words. "Quiet we bide our time, against what good things comes our way. As yourself, Will Jones, would you sit in sooth upon the throne of England? For that question we brought you hither." I did not like his lofty air, like a man cozening puppies. "I came myself, of mine own good will," I told him. "It rains outside." "True," muttered Dickon, his eyes on me. "All over Spring Coppice falls the rain, and not elsewhere. Not one but 8 charms in yonder book can bring rain. 'Twas to drive your honour to us that you might heal." "Silence," barked Valois Pembrew at him. "And to me, young sir, we read and prayed and burnt," and he glanced at the dark orange flames of the fire. "In that way we guided your footsteps to the coppice, and the rain then made you see this shelter. 'Twas all planned, even before Noel Cromwell scotched you at Worcester." "Worcester!" T roared at him so loudly that he stepped back. "What know you of Worcester fight?" He recovered and said in his erst lofty fashion, "Worcester was our doing too. We gave the victory to Noel Cromwell. At a price, from the book." He pointed to the hairy tome in the hands of Regan, his daughter. "The flames showed us your pictured hosts and his, and what befell. You might have stood against him, even prevailed, but for the horseman who would not write." I remembered that bitter amazement over how Leslie's Scots had bowed like statues. "You dare say you wrought that?" Pembroke nodded at Mistress Regan, who turned pages. "I will read it without the words of power," quoth she. "Thus, in meekness I begin my work. Stop, rider, stop, footman. 3 black flowers bloom, and under them ye must stand still as long as I will, not through me, but through the name of—" She broke off, staring at me with her slant blue eyes. I remembered all the tales of my grandfather James, who had fought and written against witchcraft. "Well then, you have given the victory to Cromwell. You will give me to him also." 2 of the 3 laughed. Dickon was still too mazed with his new health, and Pembroke shook his grizzled head. "Not so, woodcutter. Cromwell asked not the favour from us. 'Twas one of his men who paid well. We swore that old Noel should prevail from the moment of battle. But," and his eyes were like gimlets in mine, "we swore by the oaths set us, the names Cromwell's men worship, not the names we worship. We will keep the promise as long as we will, and no longer." "When it pleases us we make," contributed Regan. "When it pleases us we break. Now 'tis true that Cromwell perished on 3rd September 1658, 7 year to the day from Worcester fight. But I half believed Pembroke even as he spoke, and so would you have done. He seemed to be what he called himself, a liar in wait, a bider for prey, myself or others. The rank smoke of the fire made my head throb, and I was weary of being played with. "Let be," I said. "I am no mouse to be played with, you gib-cats." "What is your will?" "Ah," sighed Pembroke silkily, as though he had waited for me to ask. "What but that our sovereign should find his fortune again, scatter the Ironsides of the Parliament in another battle, and come to his throne at Whitehall." "It can be done," Regan assured me. "Shall I find the words in the book, that when spoken will gather and make resolute your scattered running friends?" I put up a hand. "Read nothing. Tell me rather what you would gain thereby, since you seem to be governed by gains alone." "Charles II shall reign," breathed Pembroke, "wisely and well, with thoughtful distinction. He will thank his good counsellor, the Earl, no, the Duke of Pembroke. He will be served well by Sir Dickon, his squire of the body." "Served well, I swear," promised Dickon, with no mockery to his words. "And," cooed Regan, "are there not ladies of the court? Will it not be said that Lady Regan Pembroke is fairest and most pleasing to the king's grace?" Then they were all silent, waiting for me to speak. "God pardon me my many sins, but among them has not been silence when words are needed." I laughed fiercely. "You are 3 saucy lackeys, ripe to be flogged at the cart's tail," I told them. "By tricks you learned of my ill fortune, and seek to fatten thereon." I turned toward the door. "I sicken in your company, and I leave. Let him hinder me who dare." "Dickon," called Pembroke, and moved as if to cross my path. Dickon obediently ranged alongside. I stepped up to them. "If you dread me not as your ruler, dread me as a big man and a strong," I said. "Step from my way, or I will smash your shallow skulls together." Then it was Regan, standing across the door. "Would the king strike a woman?" she challenged. "Wait for 2 words to be spoken. Suppose we have the powers we claim." "Your talk is empty, without proof," I replied. "No, mistress, bar me not, I am going." "Proof you shall have," she assured me hastily. "Dickon, stir the fire." He did so. Watching, I saw that in sooth he was but a lad. His disease, now banished by my touch, had put a false seeming of age upon him. Flames leaped up, and upon them Pembroke cast a handful of herbs whose sort I did not know. The colour of the fire changed as I gazed, white, then rosy red, then blue, then again white. The wench Regan was babbling words from the hair-bound book, but, though I had learned most tongues in my youth, I could not guess what language she read. "Ah, now," said Pembroke, "look, your gracious majesty, have you wondered of your beaten followers? In the deep of the fire, like a picture that forebore burning and moved with life. I saw tiny figures, horsemen in a huddled knot, riding in dejected wise. Though it was as if they rode at a distance, I fancied that I recognized young Strake, a cornet of Leslie's. I scowled, and the vision vanished. "You have prepared puppets or a shadow show," I accused. "I am no country hodge to be tricked thus. Ask of the fire what it will mirror to you," barred Pembrew, and I looked on him with disdain. "What of Noel Cromwell?" I demanded, and on the trice he was there. I had seen the fellow once, years '81. He looked more grey and bloated and fierce now, but it was he, Cromwell, the king rebel, in back and breast of steel with buff sleeves. He stood with wide-planted feet and a hand on his sword. I took it that he was on a porch or platform, about to speak to a throng dimly seen. "You knew that I would call for Cromwell," I charged Pembrew, and the second image too winked out. He smiled, as if my stubbornness was what he loved best on earth. "Who else then? Name one I cannot have prepared for." "Wilmot," I said, and quick anon I saw him. Poor nobleman. He was not young enough to tramp the byways in masquerade, like me. He rode a horse, and that a sorry one, with his pale face cast down. He mourned, perhaps for me. I felt like smiling at this image of my friend, and like weeping too. "Others? Your gentlemen?" suggested Pembrew, and Whitliut my naming. They sprang into view one after another, each in a breath's space. Their faces flashed among the shreds of flame: Buckingham, elegant and furtive; Lauderdale, drinking from a leather cup; Colonel Carlis, whom we called Careless, though he was never that; the brothers Penderel, by a fireside with an old dame who may have been their mother. Suddenly, as a finish to the show, Cromwell again, seen near with the Bible in his hand. The fire died like a blown candle. The room was dim and grey, with a wisp of smoke across the hide-spread window. "Well, sire, you believe," said Pembrew. He smiled now, and I saw teeth as lean and white as a hunting dog's. "Faith, only a fool would refuse to believe," I said in all honesty. He stepped near. "Then you accept us?" he questioned hoarsely. On my other hand tiptoed the fair lass Regan. "Charles," she whispered, "Charles, my comely king," and pushed herself close against me like a cat seeking caresses. "Your choice is wise," Pembroke said on. "Spells bemused and scattered your army. Spells will bring it back afresh. You shall triumph, and salt England with the bones of the rebels. Noel Cromwell shall swing from a gallows, that all like rogues may take warning. And you, brought by our powers to your proper throne." "Hold," I said, and they looked upon me silently. "I said only that I believe in your sorcery," I told them, "but I will have none of it." You would have thought those words plain and round enough. But my three neighbours in that ill house stared mutely, as if I spoke strangely and foolishly. Finally, "Oh, brave and gay, let me perish else," quoth Pembrew, and laughed. My temper went, and with it my bemusement. "Perish you shall, dog, for your saucy ways," I promised. "What, you stare and grin? Am I your sovereign lord, or am I a penny show? I have humoured you too long. Goodbye." I made a step to leave, and Pembrew slid across my path. His daughter Regan was opening the book and reciting hurriedly, but I minded her not a penny. Instead, I smote Pembrew with my fist, hard and fair in the middle of his mocking face. And down he went, full sprawl, rosy blood fountaining over mouth and chin. "Cross me again," quoth I, "and I'll drive you into your native dirt like a tether peg." With that, I stepped across his body where it quivered like a wounded snake, and put forth my hand to open the door. There was no door, not anywhere in the room. I turned back the while Regan finished reading and closed the book upon her slim finger. "You see, Charles Stuart," she smiled, You must bide here in despite of yourself." "Sir, sir," pleaded Dickon, half crouching like a cricket, "will you not mend your opinion of us?" "I will mend naught," I said, "save the lack of a door." And I gave the wall a kick that shook the stout wattlings and brought down flakes of clay. My blistered foot quivered with pain, but another kick made some of the poles spring from their fastenings. In a moment I would open a way outward, would go forth. Regan shouted new words from the book. I remember a few, like uncouth names, Sator, Aripos, Janna. I have heard since that these are powerful matters with the Gnostics. In the midst of her outcry, I thought smoke drifted before me. Smoke hats stank like dead flesh and thickened into globes and curves as if it would make a form. 2 long streamers of it drifted out like snakes to touch or seize me. I gave back, and Regan stood at my side. "Would you choose those arms?" asked she. "And not these?" She held out her own, fair and round and white. "Charles, I charmed away the door. I charmed that spirit to hold you. I will still do you good. In despite of your will you shall reign in England, and I. Weariness was drowning me. I felt like a child, drowsy and drooping. "And you," I said. "You shall tell me," she whispered. "Charles." She shimmered in my sight, and bells sang as if to signal her victory. I swear it was not I who spoke then stupidly. Consult Jack Wilmot's doggerel to see if I am wont to be stupid. But the voice came from my mouth. "I shall be king in Whitehall." She prompted me softly. "I shall be Duchess and next friend." "Duchess and next friend," I repeated. "Of the king's self," she finished, and I opened my mouth to say that too. Valois Pembroke, recovering from my buffet, sat up and listened. "But stop!" roared Dickon. We all looked, Regan and I and Valois Pembroke. Dickon rose from where he crouched. In his slim, strong hands was the foul, hairy book that Regan had laid aside. His finger marked a place on the open page. "The spells are mine, and I undo what they have wrought," he thundered in his great new voice. "Stop and silence. Look upon me, ye sorcerers and arch-sorcerers. You who attack Charles Stuart, let that witchcraft recede from him into your marrow and bone in this instant and hour." He read more, but I could not hear for the horrid cries of Pembroke and his daughter. The rawhide at the window split, like a drumhead made too hot, and cold air rushed in. The fire that had vanished leaped up, its flames bright red and natural now. Its flames scaled the roof peak, caught there. Smoke, rank and foul, crammed the place. Through it rang more screams, and I heard Regan, pantingly, "Hands from my throat!" Whatever had seized her, it was not Dickon, for he was at my side, hand on my sleeve. "Come, sire, this way." Whither the door had gone, thither it now came back. We found it open before us, scrambled through and into the open. The hut burnt behind us like a hayrick, and I heard no more cries therefrom. "Pembroke," I cried. "Regan, are they slain?" "Slain or no, it does not signify," replied Dickon. "Their ill magic retorted upon them. They are gone with it from earth forever." He hurled the hairy book into die midst of the flame. "Now away!" We left the clearing and walked the lane. There was no more rainfall, no more mist. Warm light came through the leaves as through clear green water. "Sire," said Dickon, "I part from you. God bless your kind and gracious majesty. Bring you safe to your own place, and your people to their proper senses." He caught my hand and kissed it, and would have knelt, but I held him on his feet. "Dickon," I said, "I took you for one of those liars in wait, but you have been my friend this day, and I stand in your debt as long as I live." "No, sire, no. Your touch drove from me the pain of the king's evil, which had smitten me since childhood, and which those God-forgotten could not heal with all their charms. And too, you refused witch help against Cromwell." I met his round, true eye. Sooth to say, Cromwell and I make war on each other, I replied. But 'tis human war, he said for me. Each in his way hates hell. 'Twas bravely done, sire. Remember that Cromwell's course is run in 7 years. Be content until then. Now, Godspeed. He turned suddenly and made off amid the leafage. I walked on alone, toward where the brothers Penderel would rejoin me with news of where next we would seek safety. Many things churned in my silly head, things that have not sorted themselves in all the years since, but this came to the top of the churn like fair butter. The war in England was sad and sorry and bloody, as all wars. Each party called the other God-forsaken, devilish. Each was wrong. We were but human folk, doing what we thought well and doing it ill. Worse than any human foe was sorcery and appeal to the devil's host. I promised myself then, and have not since departed from it, that when I ruled, no honest religion would be driven out. All and any such, I said in my heart, was so good that it bettered the worship of evil. Beyond that, I wished only for peace and security, and the chance to take off my blistering shoes. Lord, I prayed, if thou art pleased to restore me to the throne of my ancestors, grant me a heart constant in the exercise and protection of true worship. Never may I seek the oppression of those who, out of tenderness of their consciences, are not free to conform to outward and indifferent ceremonies. And now judge between me and Jack Wilmot, Earl of Rochester. There is at least one promise I have kept, and at least one wise deed I have done. Put that on my grave. End of The Liers in Wait by Manly Wade Wellman. The Spirits of the Lake by Alonzo Deen Cole. Weird Tales, November 1941. From The Witch's Tale, that highly popular radio broadcast which thrilled you so often over the air, comes a story specially adapted for the magazine by that famous program's author and director, Alonzo Deen Cole. Was it at the bidding of the old ones that slime, loathsome, hideously green, rose from the lake's dreadful depths to exact monstrous vengeance? Roger Benton slammed the bungalow door behind him and stamped down the path to the shore. Another month in this wilderness, and Bernice would be going about dressed in a blanket and beads, he angrily told himself, for she acted and thought more like a damned Indian every day. He'd been a fool to let her buy this island a stone's throw from the reservation on the advice of these dumb doctors. Her lungs hadn't shown any improvement here. Her condition was worse, if anything, and as for the effects of this back-to-nature stuff on him, he cursed aloud, bitterly. From across the placid lake, a monotonous Indian chant beat at his eardrums, and weak tears of self-pity welled into his eyes. Back in Chicago, his marriage to the semi-invalid Bernice had seemed a good bargain, for she was wealthy, very generous, and had never attempted to pry too deeply into his outside affairs. But here, where he saw no one but her and a handful of stinking red skins, where he heard nothing but that savage caterwauling and her incessant coughing, he flung himself into the canoe and paddled furiously toward the mainland, and Hilda Johansson. What a difference that Swedish farmer's daughter could make in his exile, if she would only cast aside her backwoods scruples. He railed inwardly at her now, for her frigid aloofness had long since fired him with a consuming infatuation. Nothing was right on this damn Michigan peninsula. Floating across the slimy lake in ceaseless, maddening rhythm, the savage chant intruded itself upon his mind again, and drove out thoughts of Hilda. He laid aside the paddle for a moment to stop his ears. So unbearable had the sound become. It had begun early this evening when the pale new moon cast its first reflection on the waters, and it would continue every night until this moon had waned. It had been Bernice's infantile delight in its crazy significance that precipitated his furious departure from the house. She had said, "It's a ceremony the tribe holds every year at this time to appease the spirits of the lake, the Nibanor Baigs, they call them. This is a holy lake to the Indians, you know, and they say if anyone affronts it or harms its friends, the Nibanor Baigs take terrible vengeance. Here she had laughed self-consciously, as well she might, before she went on. 2 horses, that's our old housekeeper's cousin, you know, spoke so convincingly of its terrors that I made it a peace offering this afternoon. I cast a bouquet of garden flowers on the waters and said a prayer 2 horses taught me. Now, no one may harm me, for fear the spirits of the lake will punish them. That last bit of addle-brained nonsense had marked the limit of Roger's endurance. What civilized man wouldn't have blown up and flown out of the house in disgust after that? And, because Bernice's silliness had driven him away so early in the evening, he would arrive at his rendezvous with Hilda half an hour too soon. Roger Benton felt terribly abused. Hilda, following the custom of her sex, did not appear until much later than the waiting man expected. When she finally came in sight, she presented a striking contrast to the thin, dark, ailing woman he had left in anger. Tall, strong, blonde as her Viking forebears, she strode with lithe grace along the forest path. Eyes that were too cold, and a thin-lipped mouth too firmly set, marred the beauty of her face. But Roger Benton had never noted these imperfections. His long wait had sharpened his desire. Forgetting past rebuffs, he rushed to meet her and clasped her in his arms. She coolly disengaged herself and sat down upon a fallen tree. Irritably, he threw himself beside her. "Hilda, why do you hold me off like this?" he pouted. "You know I'm mad, insane about you." Her thin lips curled in a faint smile. "You have no right to be mad about me. You're a married man. We're not children. You know how little I care about my wife. Besides, it's only a question of time before—" He paused. "Before she will die, you mean?" she finished simply. He turned his head away. "Yes, she thinks she's getting better, but the doctors don't tell her what they tell me." His arms clasped her again. "And the moment I'm free, I'll marry you, I swear it. But I can't wait for you till then. I've got to have you." She thrust him away roughly this time. "You will have me only as your wife. I have told you that before." His hands fell helplessly to his sides. Petulantly, resentfully, he complained, "If you really mean that, why don't you stop making a fool of me? Why do you meet me here by the lake each night, playing with me as a cat does with a mouse?" She looked at him silently for a moment, then quietly, "Because I hope he will not always be a mouse. If you are as mad about me as you say, you will not let a woman you hate stand between us much longer. What can I do? Divorce is out of the question." "Of course, then her money would be taken from you." He was annoyed. "I'm not thinking only of money." She leaned close to him. "I'm not thinking only of divorce." He stared at her for a long moment, and her cold, unwavering eyes returned his gaze. His eyes fell, and she began to talk rapidly in her low, compelling voice. The pathetic little cough rasped out again. At the sound, the man in the stern dipped his paddle more deeply into the faint shimmer of the scum-covered water. After a struggling, breathless moment, the coughing spell abated, and its victim spoke. "It's wonderful to be on the lake with you again, Roger. It's been so long since we've been in the canoe together." She laughed happily. "I feel as though we were beginning a second honeymoon." Roger Benton glanced briefly at his frail wife, grunted, and returned his attention to the paddle. In the silence that followed, the throbbing hum of the Indian chant slid steadily over the water, a brooding monotone of endless cadence. Finally, Bernice spoke again. "How solemn the chant sounds tonight, like the hymn it really is, a prayer for the dying." "For the dying?" His voice held a sharp, uncertain quality. "Yes, this is Indian summer, you know, the moon of falling leaves, of dying things. That song is a tribute to fading nature. Rather beautiful, don't you think?" The paddle trailed unheeded as he repeated abstractedly, "The moon of falling leaves, of dying things." She leaned forward a little, her dark eyes searching his face anxiously. "Roger, you act so strangely tonight. Aren't you well, dear?" He straightened, recovered himself. "I'm quite all right." He resumed his jerky, erratic stroke as she reached to place a small hand tenderly on his knee. "I know how unhappy you are here, but I'll be well again soon, and we'll go back to the city." She laughed self-consciously. "I would like to return here for just one day each year, though to renew my offering to the spirits of the lake. I've taken their protection very seriously, you see." The muscles of his jaw working spasmodically under the tanned skin, and he opened his mouth as though to speak. Quickly, placatingly, she forestalled him. "Please don't be annoyed, dear, it's such a pretty legend." He turned his head abruptly away, as though in anger or to avoid her eyes. His strokes grew faster, clumsier, stabbing angry slashes that sent the frail craft forward in plunging leaps. The woman, a little fearfully, looked behind her to see where this mad race was heading. Then she spoke again, with patently assumed unconcern. "Roger, sharp rocks are just ahead, those the Indians call the spirit's talons." She continued, as though to herself, "They say the road to the villages of the happy dead leads over such rocks as those, rocks with a knife-like edge, upon which only the good can keep their footing. The bad fall off into an abyss of eternal torment." His hysterical snarl brought her rudely to a stop. "Stop talking that filthy savage rot. It can't frighten me." Her eyes grew wide in amazement. His voice rose in a crazy yell. "I'm not afraid of spirits. They can't hurt me, and men will say it was an accident." "An accident?" Madly he continued, repeating again and again, "An accident." Her hands mounted in futile gesture to her throat, and she began to cough, gasping, terror-laden words tumbling out between the spasms. "You're making for the rocks on purpose. You know I can't swim. You mean to drown me, Roger. Don't. Turn back. Turn back." His voice and stroke beat on. "Accident. Accident." The blood drained from her face. She clawed frantically at the gunwales, tried terribly to scream. With a rending crash, the canoe splintered to matchwood on the razor-edged rocks. Roger Benton swam to shore and fell, sobbing, to the ground. From far away, the savage chant in honor of the moon of falling leaves, of dying things, still rose and fell. But he didn't hear it now. The sound of a canoe ripping upon sharp rocks was repeating over and over inside his mind. He was hearing again the horrible choking struggles of a drowning woman. He was hearing again the words she'd cried before the waters closed about her, words that would reverberate within his brain forever. "Oh God, great Gitche-Manitou, spirits of the lake," she'd prayed, "punish, punish, punish." Up the rough path from the water's edge toiled the grim little cortege Roger Benton had been dreading for a week. He watched the two approaching Indians and their grisly burden from his bedroom window, then steeled his nerves for the inevitable knock upon his door. When it came, he almost screeched his answer. The voice of Nama, the old squaw who Bernice had engaged as housekeeper, replied, "Men of my tribe, they find Missis." He quavered, "I'll be down." How he managed to descend the stairs to the living room, he didn't know, nor how he forced his rebellious eyes to focus themselves on the horror before him. But he did manage, somehow. His gaze took in the sodden divan on which they'd placed her, huge spots of lake water darkening the upholstery. The dripping figure with gaping mouth and wide eyes staring out of a pulpy mask, the weeds and moss that trailed from the streaming hair to the rug below. And, in a corner of his chaotic mind, a thought intruded that some element was missing from the scene. He searched for it vaguely. It was the brisk little county coroner who, later that day, found it for him. Wagging his head sympathetically as he prepared to leave after completion of his professional duties, "Folks round here were mighty shocked when they heard 'bout your accident on the lake and Mrs. Benton's drowning. Course, we haven't known your wife long, but everyone who met her thought she was a mighty fine lady, the Injuns especially." He paused and looked thoughtfully at the floor. "Funny thing 'bout the slime, ain't it?" Something clicked in Roger Benton's brain. "Slime," the little man nodded. "You know, the slime that covers the whole lake this time of year. There wasn't none on her. The body should have been covered with it, by rights, after being over a week in the water. Don't seem natural-like, does it?" He grinned rather sheepishly. "Course I don't hold with what them Injuns says 'bout it." With an effort the other murmured, "What do they say about it?" "Some heathen stuff 'bout the deceased being a friend of the lake spirits, and them saving her from the defilement of the slime." He chuckled. "What stuff them dumb savages do think up." Roger Benton didn't answer. He sat very still, listening to the chant that drummed against his ears through the open window. As he paddled evenly through the water, the copper-skinned boatman rested a stolid gaze upon the back of the cringing figure who sat in the center of his canoe. A very different look burned from the eyes of the expensively dressed blonde woman who reclined beside the cringing figure, a look of disgust and contempt which soon took form in rancid words. "If you could only see yourself," she sneered. "You're white as a sheet and trembling like a frightened dog." Benton turned bloodshot, pleading eyes upon her. "Won't you change your mind, Hilda? Please tell him to take us back." "When we're nearly there," her jaw set grimly. "Not much I won't. It's taken me 2 years to get you this far, and now you're going the rest of the way. You won't cheat me any longer out of the pleasure of swelling it over my old neighbors in that swanky island bungalow." He stretched a quivering hand toward her. "Hilda, I'll buy you a nicer place. I'll buy you anything you like, if you won't make me go back there." She knocked his hand aside roughly. "You could buy me the most expensive mansion on Fifth Avenue, and it wouldn't give me the kick of living on that island across from Pa's farm where I used to be so poor." A flash of forgotten spirit was in his voice as he leaned toward her out of earshot of the oarsman. "Haven't you done enough to me already? Have you forgotten the reason you're not poor now is that you made me commit a murder you had planned?" "Shut up, you fool," she hissed through clenched teeth, "and get this through your head. Once and for all, I planned nothing. I knew nothing. I did nothing. And you or nobody else can prove otherwise." The canoe slid to a stop upon the island shore. "We're here. Get up and help me out," she commanded. For a long moment he remained motionless, glaring at her with a burning hatred. Under her own steady stare, his gaze wavered, dropped. When he raised it again, it was a vacant, hopeless thing. As his wife picked a fastidious way through the shells and weed that covered the shore, old Nama waddled down the hilly path toward them. Hilda peered past her at the coveted bungalow. Satisfied with what she saw, she turned patronizingly to the squaw. "Well, old woman, looks from here like you've taken pretty good care of things." Nama returned an impassive nod, then gazed silently into her eyes. Hilda felt vaguely uncomfortable and abruptly ordered, "I want you to go back to the mainland with 2 horses." She indicated the Indian who had brought them. "You can help him bring back our baggage." With a grunt, Nama swung herself into the canoe and followed the 2 with her beady eyes as they mounted the path to the house. Roger Benton reached the porch steps, stumbled as he mounted them, and was cursed for his clumsiness. As Hilda opened the door, a sudden swell of sound smote his ears. He raised his head quickly like a startled animal. The tribesmen had begun their yearly chant across the lake. Hilda chuckled dryly. "You've heard that before. This is the singing season for these fools." "Yes," he muttered. "It's the moon of falling leaves, of dying things." Then he fell groveling at her feet. "I can't go in that house," he sobbed. "I've got to leave this island. I'm afraid here. I'm afraid." She swung the door open, pushed him inside and down on the nearest chair. Then she cursed, sneered, threatened, and cajoled until his hysteria had spent itself. When his sobs of unreasoning terror ceased, she thrust a flask of whiskey in his hand and told him, "I'm going to have a look through the house and make sure that Squaw's taken care of things. You stay quiet here till I come back," and with a sneer, "Don't let that conscience of yours get going again." The chant from across the lake beat monotonously against his ears. After a while he became aware of another sound, a dry little rasping that seemed somehow familiar, native to the place. He found a kind of peace in the strangely wanted sound, until his mind snapped open, and he realized what it was. It was an invalid's rasping cough. His scream brought Hilda down the stairs almost instantly. Voice breaking to treble pitch in his terror, he indicated the closed door that led to the living room. "I heard Bernice coughing in there." She slammed him back into the chair. "You've got her on your brain, that's all." No, he whispered. "I heard her, I tell you." He stiffened, sat upright. Behind that closed door something had coughed again. Hilda wheeled, a light of bewilderment in her face. "Say, I heard something that time." She strode purposefully to the door. He found her laughing. Absolutely empty, not a soul here but ourselves. Then both heard the cough again. He stood as if frozen, she puzzled. "Funny, we both hear it, yet this room is empty." "Oh." Impatiently she threw off the unaccustomed fear that strove to grip her. "You've got me imagining things now, that's the whole answer." Neither spoke for a full minute. Both stood tense, listening, waiting. Finally Hilda shivered slightly. "Must be going to rain," she muttered. "Feel how damp it's grown suddenly." "Yes," he quavered. "Very damp, suddenly." She followed his gaze, riveted to a spot on the floor. "Where did that come from? A minute ago this room was as neat as a pin." "What is it?" he mumbled thickly, his hands shaking. "It's slime, green slime, from the bottom of the lake." "That Squaw didn't clean," he interrupted her. "It wasn't there a minute ago. You said that yourself." "I must have overlooked it." Her voice was wavering, uncertain now. "There's another, and another, right on the divan." "Yes, and there, and there." All over the room began to appear patch after patch of the filthy slime forming silently under their horrified eyes. As they stared, the patch on the divan spread, grew till it almost covered the cushions. He gibbered, pointing a shaking finger at it. "That's where they laid her after." She turned on him savagely. "If you don't stop that, I'll brain you. There's a natural explanation for this." "Ugh!" She broke off, revulsed, as she felt the cold spat of the green stuff on her hand. "The room is full of it," he shrieked. "It's from the lake. From the spirits of the lake she prayed to punish me. I knew they would if I came back here." "They have nothing against me. I had nothing to do with—" She was interrupted by his scream of terror. Her eyes followed his, and stark panic fell upon her. On the sodden divan lay a dripping figure with wisps of weed and moss hanging from its matted hair. An instant later, they were racing madly down the wet, crumbling path to the beach, and a canoe. From the sky above them, from trees, bushes, even rocks it seemed, sprang the clammy, fetid slime, hurling itself into their faces, raising their gorge with its noxious odor, chilling their hearts with each wet impact. Suddenly the man stopped short. The woman ran on, screamed back at him to follow. "No," he sobbed. "Not out on that lake. Can't you see that's what it wants, to get us on the water?" Apparently she did not hear him, for she continued to call on him to follow. She reached the canoe, clambered in, and beckoned to him wildly. All at once her voice soared frantically higher. She pointed. "Look behind you." He pivoted, saw the grisly spectre of the drowned Bernice, its dripping arms outstretched. He floundered down the path, fell into the canoe, and grasped the paddle Hilda pressed into his hands. With the strength of despair he propelled the frail shell into the lake. After a dozen strokes, he turned to glimpse the misty figure, standing at the marge, still with arms outstretched. A moment later, the paddle broke. He sat staring at the pieces. Then worms, he mumbled. It was eaten through by worms, worms from the lake. We're drifting toward the rocks. The woman strove to waken him, to stir him to action. Do something. We'll be killed. He shook his head. The canoe wasn't drifting. Some force, powerful, utterly irresistible, was drawing them along. The woman screeched, "The rocks! We're going to strike!" He nodded slowly. A terrible quiet descended upon him, the quiet of the long condemned. Slowly he said, as though repeating a lesson from memory, "The Indians call these rocks the spirit's talons. The road to death leads over rocks like those. Only the good can keep their footing. The bad fall off into an abyss of eternal torment." "They won't harm me," Hilda shouted. "I'm going to swim to safety." He raised a deterring hand. "It's no use to try. The spirits of the lake will punish, as she said they would." She shook him off, plunged into the foaming water. He quietly watched her useless struggles as the canoe bore ever faster toward the rocks. Nahma, the old Indian woman, found their bodies days later where the lake had cast them out. The green slime, which had long since disappeared from the surface of the waters, its season past, sheathed Hilda and Roger Benton in its viscous embrace. She looked for a time out of her expressionless dark face at the grisly sight, then waddled heavily away. On the other side of the island that night, she and 2 horses each flung a handful of late garden flowers on the quiet bosom of the lake. End of The Spirits of the Lake by Alonzo Deen. The Music from Infinity by Thorp Mcclusky. Weird Tales, September 1941. That furious, triumphal piano playing, was it from somewhere in the infinite, or from the dying brain of a murderer in the electric chair? "It's 25 minutes past 11 right now," my good friend John Chambers said, "and at 12 o'clock midnight he's scheduled to die. You know why I got you over here tonight. Because you're a screwy piano player. As screwy as they come, I guess. And God knows if anybody in this world is psychic or fey, that's what they call it, isn't it? You are. Have a drink. Jerry?" I nodded and relaxed in Chambers' softest armchair as he opened a small liquor cabinet that stood in a corner of his comfortable home. A large and beautifully furnished room on the 3rd and top floor of an establishment that may best be described as a cross between a private club and a bachelor gentleman's rooming house. The sort of place with a reception room on the 1st floor, telephone service in each room, swank for minor executives at moderate cost. Just the sort of place for a wifeless young man. Chambers mixed 2 whiskey sodas, handed me mine, and sat down tautly on the davenport across the room from me. He slept, by the way, on that same davenport, though no one would have ever guessed. "Here's the story, Jerry," he said, sipping at his drink as he talked. "I haven't told you all of it before for fear you'd laugh. I waited, instead, until tonight. Whatever happens tonight, if it does happen, or nothing happens at all, I mean, it'll be over in a hurry, and that'll be the end of it. And if you want to kid me afterward, why, that's your privilege. Jerry, I want you to let me tell you this without interruptions. It's confused enough at best, and I want to be as sure as I can that I'm not missing anything that may be significant." "So," I nodded. "I am a good listener," and after a moment he continued, "I met this fellow Pierce just about a year ago when he first came to live here. Kind of a round-faced fellow, with a funny little nervous twisted smile, sort of like a cat's. Lord, you've seen his pictures in the papers enough lately so that I don't have to describe him to you. I'll bet he isn't smiling like that right now, though." He shivered slightly, glanced fearfully at the banjo clock on the wall, gulped a big swallow of his drink, and went on hastily, I struck up a sort of friendship with this Pierce right off. I'm an amiable bird anyway, and I couldn't help getting to know him. There are only about 25 fellows living here, and most of us take our breakfasts downstairs every morning, and our dinners at night too. When we've nothing special on, it's like a sort of club, really. Everybody knows everybody else, and everybody else's business too, so far as that's concerned. So I got to know Pierce right away. Had him up here for a drink, as a matter of fact, the second or third evening after he checked in the place. Lord, if anybody told me then that he'd done what he'd done, I'd have said they were crazy. He seemed the most harmless sort of fellow in the world. The only odd thing that I noticed about him was that he seemed nervous as the devil all the time, jumpy-like, and he always seemed to be sort of listening for something, some noise or sound to materialize that never did. Lots of times I had to repeat whatever I was saying to him 2 or 3 times before he'd reply, and even then he'd only answer sort of mechanically, as though he weren't really listening to me at all. Well, it was a damned annoying trait, I can tell you. I put it down to his being terribly absent-minded, and I made a private resolution that I'd find out the answer. Well, as it happened, I didn't get my first hit of information from Pierce direct. I got it from Mrs. Thomas, our landlady. She'd noticed, I guess, that I'd struck it off with Pierce, and I guessed, too, that she'd taken a violent dislike to him. She waylaid me in the hall one day and started in, "Mr. Chambers, haven't you noticed anything strange about our new Mr. Pierce?" I told her I hadn't, no. She clamped down her jaws and then snapped. "The man positively detests music. Hasn't he told you so?" "I can't say that the subject of music has ever been mentioned between us," I told her. Well, she persisted, practically went into a tirade. "Yammer, yammer, yammer, I'll reproduce it for you as well as I can," she said, and she was in dead earnest too. "Mr. Chambers, that Mr. Pierce, before he would even so much as look at my rooms, told me very emphatically that if there was a piano in the house, he wouldn't even consider staying here. Said that he hated piano playing. Of course, as it happens, there isn't a piano on the premises, though I've often considered getting one of those little spinets for the reception room. So I told Mr. Pierce the truth, that there weren't any pianos in the building, and he seemed very pleased, didn't even ask then to look at rooms, but paid me a month's lodging in advance and moved in the same day. Mark my words, Mr. Chambers, a man who hates music as much as that isn't normal. I hadn't noticed that Pierce disliked music, though I knew perfectly well that he had peculiarities, and I commented that I'd played the radio in my room lots of times when Pierce was present, and he never seemed upset. Also, I mentioned Dowd's banjo playing, down the hall, said that that never seemed to bother Pierce either. Well, that about terminated the conversation. Mrs. Thomas muttered around a little more, and then went off in a huff. I merely had the idea at the time that she'd just taken a violent dislike to her new lodger, and wanted to express that dislike in talking to me. I know now, of course, that she was right. Landladies are uncanny that way. Consciously, I didn't pay much attention at the time to what Mrs. Thomas had said, but I guess that subconsciously I kept mulling it over. I remember the thought came to me one day, all of a sudden, that I really didn't know the first damn thing about Pierce, about where he worked, if he did work, who his people were, where he came from, anything. And I realized another thing too, that funny mannerism of his, of always seeming to be listening nervously for some sound that he never actually heard, was getting more pronounced every time I saw him. By thunder, after I'd known the fellow about 2 weeks, I began to wonder if maybe Mrs. Thomas wasn't right after all about him. Watching him, and remember that I had plenty of opportunity to do just that, for we were fairly thick there for a while. I couldn't help but come to the conclusion that either the man possessed such an acutely sensitive ear that the sound of piano playing was torture to him, or he was just plain nuts, and neither of those notions exactly fitted the facts either, for no man who ever lived played a more miserable banjo than Dowd, Yet Dowd's banjo practice didn't bother Pierce at all, nor did piano playing when it came over the radio. But any sort of piano playing, good or bad, popular or classical, that came to his ears direct from the instrument, seemed to affect him like the screech of chalk on a blackboard affects a normal person. I've seen him turn white as a sheet at the faintest sound of piano playing coming from an open apartment window as we walked past. I've even seen him cross the street to avoid passing the open door of our neighborhood music store. That's the way he was all the time he lived here, normal in every respect except when it came to pianos and piano playing direct from producer to consumer. Music under those circumstances was pure, unadulterated torture to him. The more I watched him, the more I veered toward the conclusion that he was really crazy after all. Then, one night, it all came out, or so I thought at the time. It was a Saturday night and something or other had happened at the last minute to spoil my date, and it was too late then to get any other girl. So I went down the hall to Pierce's room and asked him if he didn't want to take in a movie. I was pretty sure even before I knocked that he'd be there. He very seldom went out. I know now because of that piano music phobia of his. Well, he said all right, and we took in the double feature at the Cameo, down the block, and then we went to a beer place to kill the rest of the evening. Funny about that, too, we passed up two fairly decent places for this dump where there wasn't any orchestra, not a piano even, only a machine. Pierce wouldn't go inside the first two places, just stood outside for a minute and shook his head and dragged me along until we found the last place. We stayed there until the place closed, and by that time we were feeling pretty good. As a matter of fact, we'd both had enough by then, but it was a Saturday night and I didn't have to work on Sunday. So we came back here, and I opened up a quart of scotch and we really went to town. I guess I liked Pierce more then than I ever did, before or since. The drinks had killed that nervousness of his for the time being. He wasn't listening and cringing all the time anymore. He seemed normal as hell. And after a few more shots I did the unpardonable. I asked him point blank what was the matter with him, why he had such a terrible fear of the sound of piano music. That's what too many drinks can do to a man's discretion. That question sobered him up like a bullet between the eyes. He stiffened all over for an instant, all the drunken merriment gone out of his face like magic. Then he began to tremble, horribly. The way he reacted was ghastly. I've never seen anything quite like it, but after a minute or two he got hold of himself to some extent, and he looked up at me, and there was the most pitiable, haunted expression on that man's face imaginable, twisted and haggard and agonized, like the faces in some of those old door illustrations. I'm not exaggerating when I say that his face then was the face of a man damned, utterly without hope and still tormented. That's the significant point. He looked as though his torment wasn't over, or would ever be over, but was still going on, without any end to it in sight or even hoped for. By the holy, the sight of his face then gave me the creeps. Just the thought of it still does, for that matter. Then he began to talk. Heaven knows why, except that I'd been friendly to him, and the nerve strain he was under was too great for him to bear any longer alone. Sooner or later, I guess, he would have had to talk to somebody. It just happened that that somebody was me. I'll try to tell you, as nearly as possible in his own words, everything he said. Of course he didn't say all this at once. There were pauses and interruptions, and we had more drinks, and there were times when I thought he was going to break down entirely. It was 4 o'clock in the morning before he finished. "I'll tell you, Chambers," he said, his voice very soft and low and without a tremor in it as he began, though his face was twitching and his hands shaking. "I haven't known you very long, but you've been a damn good friend, and I'll tell you. You know my name is Harry Pierce. There are lots of Harry Pierces in the world, but I'm the Harry Pierce." Well, that didn't mean a thing to me, and I guess my face showed it, for he went on. "I'm the Harry Pierce whose wife died last August of a lingering illness, they called it. Pernicious anemia, the death certificate read. She was a pianist, a professional, played jazz, but she played it like a concert artist. Her maiden name was Alicia Castle. That's the name she played under. I knew, of course, who Alicia Castle had been, who doesn't, and I thought immediately that I had the whole story. Loving husband, wife, fine pianist, dies. Husband can no longer bear to hear piano music, as he had heard it so many times in his home, soft and loud, fragmentary bits, practicing. The human side of music that's somehow missing on a record or over the radio. Poor devil, I thought. I felt sympathetic, all right. The feeling of intimacy the drinks had built up, and then this confession Pierce had made that had so dramatically and poignantly explained his peculiar phobia. I tried to be as delicate as possible in my sympathy. I looked down at my hands and murmured, "She was a wonderful pianist, wasn't she? I remember she always played Dancing in the Wind at the start and finish of her radio programs. And she was your wife." He didn't seem to be listening. He just sat there across from me, right where you're sitting now. And like me, he kept looking down at his hands. Only his hands were trembling violently. After a moment he muttered, and his voice was so savage that I almost jumped. "Dancing in the Wind." God, how I loathe that piece. I didn't say anything, I was afraid to, and in a minute or two he started up again, and the words just poured out of him. "Hell chambers," he babbled, with the most peculiar, pitiful eagerness. "Ghosts don't exist. They just don't exist, and that's all there is to it. Especially ghosts that don't do anything but just play piano." He reached for the bottle of scotch, poured himself a good 6 ounces, tossed it off in one sobbing gulp that didn't even jar him. He went on talking. Raving maybe's the better word. "It's been like that ever since the night she died. Piano playing. Her piano playing. I can't mistake it, I know her touch, her style of playing, the licks she used that nobody else can imitate, like I know my own face. It's her playing. Nobody else. It's unmistakable, unmistakable, I tell you, and it's been going on ever since the night she died. Whenever I get near a piano, sooner or later I hear her playing. Not all the time, sometimes she plays only one piece, or just part of a piece, and then stops as though she's been called away. Dancing in the Wind, she plays a lot. She had a special arrangement of it, and nobody else can hear her. Nobody else can hear her playing. Only me. It can't be, such a thing can't be. There aren't ghosts. There can't be ghosts. But when I get near a piano, sooner or later I hear her ghost playing. The night she died I heard her first, playing on the big grand downstairs in the living room. I went down, but before I got downstairs the music stopped. The room was empty, nobody there. But Lucas, he was our butler then, was outside in the foyer. I asked him who'd been playing the piano in the living room, and he said, "Nobody, Mr. Pierce. I haven't heard a sound from the living room all evening." So I went upstairs again. Twice more that night I heard it, the sound of her playing, and both times nobody else heard it, nobody but me. I asked, "I know." The servants were beginning to look at me as though they thought I was queer. I knew they were beginning to talk among themselves. So I shut up, just watched them, watched the people in the house, the friends and relatives who were dropping in all the time to pay their condolences. 3 or 4 times the next day, I heard her playing. Each time I was in the living room, and each time other people were with me, old friends who had known her well and who wanted to look at her, and to look at me too, and see for themselves how I was bearing up. God, it was barbaric. The casket stood between the north windows, on the opposite side of the room from the piano. Standing with my back to the piano, standing between my friends looking down into her pale, wasted face, I could hear her playing there behind me, but nobody else heard. Nobody else heard. I watched their faces, and I know. To them the piano was silent, yet I heard it playing 3 or 4 times that day. God, God, God. I know that once I almost fainted when I heard it. Kenny Coates had to grasp my arms and hold me up until I came out of it. He helped me upstairs and gave me brandy and made me lie down for a while. I was afraid to ask him if he'd heard the music, because I knew he hadn't. I began to wonder if I wasn't going crazy. And the next day, and the day of the funeral, it was the same. Music that only I heard, Alicia's music, coming from the damnable piano downstairs. I didn't sleep 3 total hours from the moment she died until they buried her. I was trying to think, trying to fathom out the thing, to keep from going wholly mad. I knew that it was a sort of short circuit in my own brain that was causing the trouble. I kept telling myself over and over that the sounds didn't really exist, or other persons would have heard them. But I knew too that if I didn't conquer the sickness, sooner or later I'd go stark raving mad. Part of my brain was sick already. I had to keep the sickness from becoming any worse. I have willpower, plenty of it, but I couldn't overcome this thing. I even forced myself to sit in the living room by the piano, hour after hour, waiting to hear the music, waiting to see if the piano keys would also appear to move. I wanted to find out if my sickness extended as far as hallucination, included my vision as well as my hearing. But whenever I watched the piano, it wouldn't play. It only played when my back was turned, and always when I was in the presence of other people, never when I was alone. It was like a devil in my brain, trying to make me act ridiculous, strange, mad, in front of my servants and friends. The day of the funeral was the worst. Right in the middle of the prayer, the music began, dancing in the wind again. It kept up all the way through the prayer, until the prayer was finished and the quartet began to sing. I had to bite my lips to keep from screaming. But I have a strong will. I conquered that time. Yet someday I won't, and I'm afraid that then they'll find out my secret and take me away and lock me up as a madman. After she was buried, I came back to the house and shut myself in my room. All that night I stayed awake, waiting to hear that music. But there was no music then, not a note. It was just as though my sickness had gone with the people who for 3 days had filled my house. But I knew that perhaps it was just waiting another opportunity. The next afternoon, Kenny Coates dropped in. He's my attorney, and one of my best friends. I couldn't refuse to see him. I met him in the library, across the hall from the living room. Just as soon as we started talking, it began again. As always, it seemed to come from the big grand in the living room, and I could hear it plainly, though the 2 intervening doors were closed. Cutting right into what Kenny was saying, blotting out his words, blotting out all my senses except my hearing, blotting out everything except itself. I don't know how I looked then, or how I acted, but my reaction must have been pretty ghastly. For the next thing I remember was Kenny handing me a drink with his face as white as a sheet and saying over and over, "Good God. Harry, you look shot to pieces. For a minute there I thought you were going to fold up. I tell you, you've got to snap out of it or it won't be long before you follow Alicia. Get away, take a cruise, go to Canada, do anything to try and shake off this nervous condition that's got hold of you. Otherwise..." I guess I must have been still in a fog, for I remember that I asked him, "But the music, Harry, didn't you hear the music?" He shook his head. "Music? What music?" That clinched it. I knew then that I had to get away, so I did. I turned my business over to a friend. I guess he'd been half anticipating that I'd do just that, and went to Canada, to a little place where I've been going every fall for years to hunt. I stayed there for 3 weeks. I was really beginning to feel better. Since leaving the city, I hadn't once heard that fiendish piano playing. Then, one Saturday night, Pierre Chouinard, he owns the lodge where I was stopping, asked me if I didn't want to go to a barn dance at the village, and some devil in me made me say yes. When we entered that hall, the first thing I noticed was that there was a piano, an old worn-out upright on a makeshift bandstand. The sight of it gave me a queasy feeling for a minute, but the feeling passed off. There was too much noise and merriment and gaiety going on. The orchestra was a couple of fiddlers, a pianist and a drummer. They weren't bad. They played round and square dances mostly, with every once in a while a waltz, and everybody danced, old and young alike. At 10 o'clock, the orchestra took its intermission, and we all lined up in a row for refreshments, ice cream and cake. I was just reaching out my hand for mine. Pierre was standing directly behind me when the music started. It came from that old rattle-trap on the bandstand. The piece was Dancing in the Wind, and it was Alicia playing. No matter how tinny the music was, no matter how distorted by that god-awful, out-of-tune instrument with its loose strings and its dead notes, nothing could disguise that. It was Alicia playing all right, playing that wreck of a piano to me alone. I looked at the bandstand, and there wasn't anybody there. Not even the orchestra. They had all gone off the stand somewhere to smoke and eat their ice cream. Through that hellish music, I heard my dish smash on the floor at my feet, and that's the last thing I remembered then. I woke up in my bunk in Pierre's cabin with a raging fever. Pierre wasn't in the room, and I lay there for a while thinking and trembling. Funny thing, but my thoughts were clear as crystal. I could recollect everything that had happened since I'd left my own house back in the city. And it occurred to me all at once that I had never actually been within hearing distance of a piano in all that time, until the night of the barn dance. I had gone from my house to my train, and from that train to another train, and then I had ridden in an automobile, and then in a wagon, and of course, in Pierre's lodge there was no piano. I tried to figure out what craziness was in me that made me seem to hear Alicia playing. Sooner or later, whenever I came near a piano, I remembered clearly that that old rattle-trap had seemed to sound exactly like itself, with all its mechanical imperfections and poor tuning, not at all like our big grand. Then I began to wonder if my own couldn't conceivably have twisted its own conception of Alicia's playing to conform to the limitation of this tinny old instrument. The thing seemed not impossible. If my mind could make me imagine that I heard Alicia playing, it could certainly also make me imagine that I heard her playing various pianos, especially after I'd had a good chance to hear each of those instruments. And I had been listening to that decrepit old upright all evening. Certainly no supernatural influence was at work. It was all in my own mind. I remembered a story I had read somewhere about a man who had imagined that a monkey was following him about. The story ended, I believe, with the man slitting his own throat. I made up my mind then and there to get back to the city and consult a psychiatrist. A good one. 3 days later I was well enough to travel, so I returned to the city. I didn't go to my own home, but registered at an hotel instead. I was afraid to go back to my own house, full as it was of memories of Alicia, and with that accursed grand piano waiting for me in the downstairs living room. The only way I could have gone home would have been to first have that piano moved out of the house, and I was afraid to do that. Afraid of what people would think and say. The servants had heard me talking queerly, so had Kenny Coates. A hotel was the only solution. When I registered, I asked for a quiet room, isolated from the ballroom and dining room. I told the desk clerk frankly that I couldn't bear the sound of music, especially piano music. The room he gave me was all right. There wasn't a piano within a half-dozen floors of me, but I couldn't stay in that room indefinitely. The first time I came downstairs, as I got off the elevator in the lobby, I heard that devilish piano playing again, coming from the dining room. God! It followed me all the way across the lobby, growing fainter and fainter as I walked away from it. I could hear it up until the instant that I passed through the revolving doors to the street. Then I couldn't hear it anymore. I went directly to consult a psychiatrist, told him the same story I've told you. He seemed interested as hell, told me that my malady was extremely rare, used a lot of big words, and ended up by advising me that my only salvation lay in fighting the thing. Well, I did just that. I did exactly as this man advised. I didn't go home because of my memories of Alicia, but for 3 months I lived in that accursed hotel, went to my office every day and transacted my business as well as I was able, ate my morning and evening meals in that hotel dining room every day, and listened to that ghastly music pounding in my brain every mortal day in the week. Always in the hotel dining room I heard it, not when the orchestra was playing, of course, only when they were silent between pieces. But I heard it other places too, through an open window as I was hurrying to catch a subway, a fragment of Dancing in the Wind hitting me in the face from the swinging doors of a saloon as I walked past. Even from the orchestra pit of a theatre, God, anywhere and any time. I haven't gone inside a theatre since. That had a piano. I haven't dared. For 3 months I fought it, but I couldn't beat it. I can't beat it. 2 weeks ago I finally gave up the fight. I moved out of the hotel, took the room here. For one reason only, because there isn't a piano in the place. When I'm inside these walls I have peace of a sort. It's only when I go out that I hear the music. And I'm careful about where I go, what streets and even which side of the street I walk on, so that I'm seldom exposed. Maybe the disease will go away of itself in time. I don't know. I only know that I haven't the strength or the courage to fight it any longer. That way would lead to total insanity quicker than the way I have chosen. That's all, Chambers, everything. Now you know why I am as I am, why I act as I do. I trust that you will keep this confession to yourself. John Chambers, who for almost half an hour had been talking in a steady, quiet monotone as he gave to me, as nearly as possible in Harry Pierce's own words, the peculiar confession Pierce had made to him in this same room 12 months earlier, paused abruptly in his narrative. Without a word, he rose from the davenport, took my glass and his own, walked over to the liquor cabinet and mixed 2 more drinks. He handed me mine. I nodded without speaking, and he went back to his place and reseated himself. Then he said, his voice still quiet, still restrained, though I knew his thoughts were racing. "It was good of you to listen to me so long, Jerry, without interrupting. I'm glad you did, for I wanted you to get the complete picture without missing anything, no matter how insignificant some details may seem. There are details which may have vast significance, contrasted with others which may mean nothing. I thought it best to tell you everything that I remembered. Well, the rest of the story is told from my own viewpoint. It's exactly what I saw and heard. Pierce never again mentioned his odd confession to me, and I of course also refrained from referring to it. And it was just 2 weeks later that he finally broke. Funny how it came about. One of those jokes of fate that are always happening and that none of us can foresee or guard against. It happened on a Friday evening about 11:30. I know it wasn't any later than that, because I have to work on Saturday mornings, and I was still sitting up, fully dressed, reading, when I heard this awful scream. It wasn't like anything human, I can tell you. It wasn't even recognizable as a man's or a woman's voice. It was more like a fiend screaming in hell, or a witch burning at the stake, maybe. It was loud. It stabbed into my ears like a knife, left them ringing for seconds afterward. I was out of my room and down the stairs in nothing flat, and everybody else in the house too. They were down in the front hall, Harry Pierce, and 2 men who, it turned out, were Kenny Coates and Alicia's brother. Frank Castle, his name was. Frank Castle and this Coates were both holding Pierce by the arms to keep him from sagging to the floor. After that single scream, Pierce hadn't screamed any more, but there was froth on his lips and dribbling down his chin, and his face was white as paper and streaming sweat. And his eyes, God, they were the eyes of a trapped, maddened beast, and he was mumbling over and over, his mouth lax and drooling, his whole body trembling spasmodically. "Yes, I did it, Alicia. I'll confess, Alicia. Hear me, Alicia. I'll confess. I killed you. Killed you with arsenic so slowly that nobody knew. I'll tell now. Tell the world now that if they exhume your body, they'll find enough arsenic in you to kill a dozen people. Hear me, Alicia, hear me. I'm confessing, God, I'm confessing. It's what you've wanted all along, I know. You've won, Alicia. You've won. You've beaten me. I'm confessing, Alicia. I'm confessing that I killed you with arsenic. Over and over and over he went on like a broken record. Well, except for a few loose ends, that's all there is to the story to date that you haven't already read in the papers. The confession came as a total surprise to me, of course, but I can see now how completely it explained things. Explained Pierce's terrible nervousness, his peculiar insanity, everything. His conscience was hounding him every minute, day and night. Through all those months his life must have been a perfect hell. It turned out that the three of them had met earlier in the evening, dined at some place where there was no piano, and come here afterward, where you know that the brother demanded that Alicia's body be exhumed, which was done, and they found that sure enough she was saturated with arsenic. Pierce pleaded not guilty on grounds of insanity, but the alienists shot his story full of holes. They examined him, and they put him in rooms with pianos. And he tried to fake the malady he said he'd been experiencing all along, and they proved that he was just faking. Then he tried to say that he hadn't heard that ghostly piano playing any more since the minute he'd confessed, and that only made it worse. The prosecution made a monkey out of him, proved that his business had been perilously close to the rocks, that he had been inordinately jealous of Alicia because of her radio reputation and because she made more money than he did, and that he'd killed Alicia for her insurance. The jury found him guilty in half an hour, and the judge sentenced him to burn. And tonight's the night. That's why you're here. Oh, there's one point that I forgot. Remember I said that the reason Pierce broke when he did was one of those jokes of fate that nobody can foresee or guard against? Well, the joke was this. That same day, while Pierce was out, Mrs. Thomas bought a piano. A little spinet. She'd always wanted one anyway for the reception room. She didn't like Pierce, of course, and didn't care a damn whether he stayed on or moved out on account of it. So I suppose when she saw it, she merely thought, the hell with him, and ordered it sent out. It came that evening, and it was put in the reception room near the door, not 10 feet from where Pierce went haywire as he walked into the house. But the real reason I've got you up here tonight, Jerry, is this. It may all be imagination, but thinking back after all the commotion and excitement that night had subsided, I can't get out of my mind the notion that, just before Pierce screamed, I heard somebody playing that piano downstairs. Just a fragment of music, just for an instant, and then the scream blotted it out. Music that had a sort of unreal quality to it, as though someone was playing loudly, but at a great distance, like the music that comes across a lake at night, like, oh Lord. This is a lame comparison, but it's accurate, like music heard when you hold just the needle to a phonograph record in your fingers, diminished almost to nothingness, yet strong and powerful. Microscopic, yet full of fury. You understand? And the piece was Dancing in the Wind. Jerry, you're here because I believe that I heard that music, that same music that drove Pierce to confess. Maybe it was only an emanation from Pierce's own tortured brain, I don't know, but I am certain that I heard it. There have been times when I thought that I was clairvoyant, Jerry, not tremendously so, like mediums, but just a little bit. And if I'm sensitive at all to such things, I know that you're 10 times more so. Jerry, I feel that if it were truly Alicia's spirit driving Harry Pierce to confess through her music, we will hear her play again tonight for the last time when he dies, because she knows that I know the whole story, as no other person on earth knows it. And I feel that if Alicia's spirit exists and can communicate with us, it will try to get one last message through to me, to let me know that it lives and that it has triumphed. I moved uneasily at that, looked down at my glass, which was empty, and shook my head. Sorry, John. It doesn't necessarily follow that if you or I, or both of us, hear this ghost music, tonight we're consequently demonstrated the reality of Alicia's spirit and, naturally, of a whole spirit world. For telepathy does exist, we know that, and I can see no way in which we can eliminate beyond doubt the possibility that whatever music we may hear might not have come to us direct from Pierce's brain at the moment of death. The human brain sends out strange and powerful impulses when it is about to die, visions of loved ones, sometimes startlingly vivid and real, sometimes speaking or otherwise transmitting definite messages. There are thousands of authenticated instances. So, whether the music originates with Alicia or merely in Pierce's dying brain, that's a question we can never answer. John Chambers shivered, and his face went grey. Jerry, it's 4 minutes past 12, and he's to die at midnight. And in that instant, God, from downstairs, through that quiet house, came the sound of furious, triumphal piano playing. It was jazz, but what jazz? Sophisticated, transcendental playing, a strong lifting rhythm glittering with embellishments and flying notes that transformed the saccharine melody into a surging clangor of glamorous sound. Not 10 jazz pianists in the world could play like that, I knew, and of those 10 only Alicia Castle had ever played that particular special arrangement. It was Alicia Castle, all right, playing as I had heard her play innumerable times at the start and finish of her coast-to-coast network broadcasts. The piece danced along to its conclusion, a sparkling shower of notes that burst and coruscated like a musical skyrocket, and then the music was gone from my brain. The silence that followed was deafening. For a full minute we sat there, neither speaking. There was no sound in the house. Whatever we had been heard by nobody else. Then John Chambers looked at me, and his face was white. "Did you hear it?" he whispered. I nodded. "Loud," I croaked. "Loud as hell, dancing in the wind." He licked his lips like a frightened dog. "I only heard it faintly," he muttered. "Just like the other time. You're more psychic than I." We sat there dumbly, as though paralyzed, through long minutes. At last John's lips moved. "Pierce is dead, Jerry, I know it. He died when we heard that music, and you're right in what you said. We can never know beyond doubt whether that music came from Alicia, somewhere in the infinite, or from his own poor dying brain. It's a thing we'll never know." I nodded. It was a thing we would never know. Again we sat silent. Then, almost musingly and wholly irrelevantly, I spoke the words that were to lead us to the unbelievable conclusion. "Funny thing about that damned music, John," I said. "The B flat above middle C didn't play. It was missing all the way through the piece." "B flat above middle C," he echoed. "That's a black note, isn't it?" I nodded. "If it's busted on that piano downstairs, and if I know that it's only been busted a few days, that would prove that Pierce, up in the death house, couldn't have known of it, wouldn't it?" Again I nodded. I was beginning to understand what he was driving at. He jumped to his feet. "Come on. Wednesday night we were playing poker down there and Bob Ellis's chair went over backward and broke a black key on the piano. Mrs. Thomas doesn't even know about it yet. We'll see if it's the one." We went downstairs softly, for it was late and the house was sleeping. We went into the darkened reception room. Chambers didn't wait to turn on the lights. In the darkness I reached out and depressed the B flat. At first gently, then vigorously, I shook the key up and down. The note was dead, the hammer shaft broken. In the dim dark I heard Chambers whisper, "It's the one?" My voice was taut, unnatural, high-pitched as I whispered my reply, "It's the one." His voice was quivering too now, as with a curious triumphant eagerness he persisted. "Then it was Alicia. Who was sending music to our ears from this piano tonight? I could feel the flesh crawling along my spine as I sought to formulate my answer. It was incredible, yet there was only one answer. Could be only one answer. Then, my lips stiff and dry, my heart palpitating like a trip hammer, I spoke that answer. Yes, John. It was Alicia. End of the music from Infinity by Thorp Mcclusky. Train for Flushing by Malcolm Jameson. Weird Tales, March 1940. They ought never to have hired that man. Even the most stupid of personnel managers should have seen at a glance that he was mad. Perhaps it is too much to expect such efficiency these days. In my time, a thing like this could not have happened. They would have known the fellow was under a curse. It only shows what the world has come to. But I can tell you that if we ever get off this crazy runaway car, I intend to turn the Interborough wrong side out. They needn't think because I am an old man and retired that I am a nobody they can push around. My son Henry, the lawyer one, will build a fire under them. He knows people in this town. And I am not the only victim of the maniac. There is a pleasant, elderly woman here in the car with me. She was much frightened at first, but she had recognized me for a solid man, and now she stays close to me all the time. She is a Mrs. Herrick, and a quite nice woman. It was her idea that I write this down. It will help us refresh our memories when we come to testify. Just at the moment, we are speeding atrociously downtown along the 7th Avenue line of the subway, but we are on the Uptown Express track. The first few times we tore through those other trains, it was terrible. I thought we were sure to be killed. And even if we were not, I have to think of my heart. Dr. Steinbach told me only last week how careful I should be. Mrs. Herrick has been very brave about it, but it is a scandalous thing to subject anyone to, above all such a kindly little person. The madman who seems to be directing us, if charging wildly up and down these tracks implies direction, is now looking out the front door, staring horribly at the gloom rushing at us. He is a big man and heavy-set, very weathered and tough-looking. I am nearing 80 and slight. There is nothing I can do but wait for the final crash. For crash we must sooner or later, unless some Interborough official has brains enough to shut off the current to stop us. If he escapes the crash, the police will know him by his heavy red beard and tattooing on the backs of his hands. The beard is square-cut, and there cannot be another one like it in all New York. But I notice I have failed to put down how this insane ride began. My granddaughter, Mrs. Charles L. Tenek, wanted me to see the World's Fair and was to come in from Great Neck and meet me at the subway station. I will say that she insisted someone come with me, but I can take care of myself. I always have, even if my eyes and ears are not what they used to be. The train was crowded, but somebody gave me a seat in a corner. Just before we reached the stop, the woman next to me, this Mrs. Herrick, had asked if I knew how to get to Whitestone from Flushing. It was while I was telling her what I knew about the buses that the train stopped and let everybody off the car but us. I was somewhat irritated at missing the station, but knew that all I had to do was stay on the car, go to Flushing and return. It was then that the maniac guard came in and behaved so queerly. This car was the last one in the train, and the guard had been standing where he belongs on the platform. But he came into the car, walking with a curious rolling walk, but I do not mean to imply he was drunk, for I do not think so. And his manner was what you might call masterful, almost overbearing. He stopped at the middle door and looked very intensely out to the north at the sound. "That is not the Scheldt," he called out angrily with a thick foreign accent, and then he said "Bah!" loudly, in a tone of disgusted disillusionment. He seemed of a sudden to fly into a great fury. The train was just making its stop at the end of the line, in Flushing. He rushed to the forward platform and somehow broke the coupling. At the same moment, the car began running backward along the track by which we had come. There was no chance for us to get off, even if we had been young and active. The doors were not opened, It happened so quickly. Then he came into the car, muttering to himself. His eye caught the sign of painted tin they put in the windows to show the destination of the trains. He snatched the plate lettered Flushing and tore it to bits with his rough hands, as if it had been cardboard, throwing the pieces down and stamping on them. That is not Flushing, not my Flushing, not Vlissingen, but I will find it. I will go there, and not all the devils in hell nor all the angels in heaven shall stop me. He glowered at us, beating his breast with his clenched fists, as if angry and resentful at us for having deceived him in some manner. It was then that Mrs. Herrick stooped over and took my hand. We had gotten up close to the door to step out at the World's Fair station, but the car did not stop. It continued its wild career straight on, at dizzy speed. "Rugwatch!" he shouted, or something equally unintelligible. Back I must go, like always, but yet will find my Vlissingen. Then followed the horror of pitching headlong into those trains. The first one we saw coming, Mrs. Herrick screamed. I put my arm around her and braced myself as best I could with my cane. But there was no crash, just a blinding succession of lights and colors in quick winks. We seemed to go straight through that train from end to end at lightning speed, but there was not even a jar. I do not understand that, for I saw it coming clearly. Since there have been many others, I have lost count now. We meet so many, and swing from one track to another so giddily at the end of runs. But we have learned, Mrs. Herrick and I, not to dread the collisions, or say, passage, so much. We are more afraid of what the bearded ruffian who dominates this car will do next. Surely we cannot go on this way much longer. It has already been many, many hours. I cannot comprehend why the stupid people who run the Interborough do not do something to stop us, so that the police could subdue this maniac and I can't have Henry take me to the district attorney. So read the first few pages of the notebook turned over to me by the Missing Persons Bureau. Neither Mrs. Herrick nor Mr. Dennison, whose handwriting it is, has been found yet, nor the guard he mentions. In contradiction, the Interborough insists no guard employed by them is unaccounted for, and further, that they never had a man of the above description on their payrolls. On the other hand, they have as yet produced no satisfactory explanation of how the car broke loose from the train at Flushing. I agree with the police that this notebook contains matter that may have some bearing on the disappearances of these two unfortunate citizens. Yet here in the psychiatric clinic we are by no means agreed as to the interpretation of this provocative and baffling diary. The portion I have just quoted was written with a fountain pen in a crabbed, tremulous hand, quite exactly corresponding to the latest examples of old Mr. Dennison's writing. Then we find a score or more of pages torn out, and a resumption of the record in indelible pencil. The handwriting here is considerably stronger and more assured, yet unmistakably that of the same person. Farther on, there are other places where pages have been torn from the book, and evidence that the journal was but intermittently kept. I quote, now all that is legible of the remainder of it. Judging by the alternations of the cold and hot seasons, we have now been on this weird and pointless journey for more than 10 years. Oddly enough, we do not suffer physically, although the interminable rushing up and down these caverns under the streets becomes boring. The ordinary wants of the body are strangely absent or dulled. We sense heat and cold, for example, but do not find their extremes particularly uncomfortable, while food has become an item of far distant memory. I imagine, though, we must sleep a good deal. The guard has very little to do with us, ignoring us most of the time as if we did not exist. He spends his days sitting brooding at the far end of the car, staring at the floor, mumbling in his wild red beard. On other days he will get up and peer fixedly ahead as if seeking something. Again he will pace the aisle in obvious anguish, flinging his outlandish curses over his shoulder as he goes. Verdurmt and verwünscht are the commonest ones. We have learned to recognize them, and he tears his hair in frenzy whenever he pronounces them. His name, he says, is Vanderdecken, and we find it politic to call him Captain. I have destroyed what I wrote during the early years, all but the account of the very first day. It seems rather querulous and hysterical now. I was not in good health then, I think, but I have improved noticeably here, and that without medical care. Much of my stiffness, due to a recent arthritis, has left me, and I seem to hear better. Mrs. Herrick and I have long since become accustomed to our forced companionship, and we have learned much about each other. At first, we both worried a good deal over our family's concern about our absence. But when this odd and purposeless kidnapping occurred, we were already so nearly to the end of life, being of about the same age, that we finally concluded our children and grandchildren must have been prepared for our going soon, in any event. It left us only with the problem of enduring the tedium of the interminable rolling through the tubes of the Interborough. In the pages I have deleted, I made much of the annoyance we experienced during the early weeks due to flickering through oncoming trains. That soon came to be so commonplace, occurring as it did every few minutes, that it became as unnoticeable as our breathing. As we lost the fear of imminent disaster, our riding became more and more burdensome through the deadly monotony of the tunnels. Mrs. Herrick and I diverted ourselves by talking, and to think in my earlier entries in this journal I complained of her garrulousness, or by trying to guess at what was going on in the city above us by watching the crowds on the station platforms. That is a difficult game, because we are running so swiftly, and there are frequent intervening trains. A thing that has caused us much speculation and discussion is the changing type of advertising on the bill posters. Nowadays they are featuring the old favorites. Many of the newer toothpastes and medicines seem to have been withdrawn. Did they fail, or has a wave of conservative reaction overwhelmed the country? Another marvel in the weird life we lead is the juvenescence of our home, the runaway car we are confined to. In spite of its unremitting use always at top speed, it has become steadily brighter, more new-looking. Today, it has the appearance of having been recently delivered from the builders' shops. I learned half a century ago that having nothing to do, and all the time in the world to do it in, is the surest way to get nothing done. In looking in this book, I find it has been 10 years since I made an entry. It is a fair indication of the idle, routine life in this wandering car. The very invariableness of our existence has discouraged keeping notes. But recent developments are beginning to force me to face a situation that has been growing ever more obvious. The cumulative evidence is by now almost overwhelming that this state of ours has a meaning, has an explanation. Yet I dread to think the thing through, to call its name, because there will be two ways to interpret it. Either it is as I am driven to conclude, or else I must talk it over frankly with Nellie Herrick. She is remarkably poised and level-headed and understanding. She and I have matured a delightful friendship. What disturbs me more than anything is the trend in advertising. They are selling products again that were popular so long ago that I had actually forgotten them, and the appeals are made in the idiom of years ago. Lately it has been hard to see the posters. The station platforms are so full. In the crowds are many uniforms, soldiers and sailors. We infer from that there is another war, but the awful question is, what war? Those are some of the things we can observe in the world over there. In our own little fleeting world, things have developed even more inexplicably. My health and appearance, notably. My hair is no longer white. It is turning dark again in the back and on top. And the same is true of Nellie's. There are other similar changes for the better. I see much more clearly, and my hearing is practically perfect. The culmination of these disturbing signals of retrogression has come with the newest posters. It is their appearance that forces me to face the facts. Behind the crowds we glimpse new appeals, many and insistent, buy Victory Loan bonds. From the number of them to be seen, one would think we were back in the happy days of 1919, when the soldiers were coming home from the World War. My talk with Nellie has been most comforting and reassuring. It is hardly likely that we should both be insane and have identical symptoms. The inescapable conclusion that I dreaded to put into words is so. It must be so. In some unaccountable manner, we are unliving life. Time is going backward. Rugwatch, the mad Dutchman, said that first day when he turned back from Flushing, "We will go backward to his Flushing, the one he knew." Who knows what Flushing he knew? It must be the Flushing of another age, or else why should the deranged wizard, if it is he who has thus reversed time, choose a path through time itself? Helpless, we can only wait and see how far he will take us. We are not wholly satisfied with our new theory. Everything does not go backward, otherwise how could it be possible for me to write these lines? I think we are like flies crawling up the walls of an elevator cab while it is in full descent. Their own proper movements, relative to their environment, are upward, but all the while they are being carried relentlessly downward. It is a sobering thought. Yet we are both relieved that we should have been able to speak it. Nellie admits that she has been troubled for some time, hesitating to voice the thought. She called my attention to the subtle way in which our clothing has been changing, an almost imperceptible de-evolution in style. We are now on the lookout for ways in which to date ourselves in this headlong plunging into the past. Shortly after writing the above, we were favored with one opportunity not to be mistaken. It was the night of the armistice. What a night in the subway! Then followed, in inverse order, the various issues of the Liberty bonds. Over 40 years ago, counting time both ways, forward, then again backward, I was up there, $1 a year man selling them on the streets. Now we suffer a new anguish, imprisoned down here in this racing subway car. The evidence all around us brings a nostalgia that is almost intolerable. None of us knows how perfect his memory is until it is thus prompted. But we cannot go up there. We can only guess at what is going on above us. The realization of what is really happening to us has caused us to be less antagonistic to our conductor. His sullen brooding makes us wonder whether he is not a fellow victim. Rather than our abductor, he seems so unaware of us usually. At other times, we regard him as the principal in this drama of the gods, and are bewildered at the curious twist of fate that has entangled us with the destiny of the unhappy Vanderdeschen, for unhappy he certainly is. Our anger at his arrogant behavior has long since died away. We can see that some secret sorrow gnaws continually at his heart. "There is een vloek over me," he said gravely one day, halting unexpectedly before us in the midst of one of his agitated pacings of the aisle. He seemed to be trying to explain, apologize for, if you will, our situation. "Accursed I am, damned." He drew a great breath, looking at us appealingly. Then his black mood came back on him with a rush, and he strode away growling mighty Dutch oaths. "But I will best them, God himself shall not prevent me, not if it takes all eternity." Our orbit is growing more restricted. It is a long time now since we went to Brooklyn, and only the other day we swerved suddenly at Times Square and cut through to Grand Central. Considering this circumstance, the type of car we are in now, and our costumes, we must be in 1905 or thereabouts. That is a year I remember with great vividness. It was the year I first came to New York. I keep speculating on what will become of us. In another year, we will have plummeted the full history of the subway. What then? Will that be the end? Nellie is the soul of patience. It is a piece of great fortune, a blessing, that since we were doomed to this wild ride, we happened in it together. Our friendship has ripened into a warm affection that lightens the gloom of this tedious wandering. It must have been last night that we emerged from the caves of Manhattan. 34 years of darkness is ended. We are now out in the country going west. Our vehicle is not the same. It is an old-fashioned day coach, and ahead is a small locomotive. We cannot see engineer or fireman, but Vanderdecken frequently ventures across the swaying, open platform and mounts the tender, where he stands firmly with widespread legs, scanning the country ahead through an old brass long glass. His uniform is more nautical than railroadish. It took the sunlight to show that to us. There was always the hint of salt air about him. We should have known who he was from his insistence on being addressed as Captain. The outside world is moving backward. When we look closely at the wagons and buggies in the muddy trails alongside the right-of-way fence, we can see that the horses or mules are walking or running backward. But we pass them so quickly, as a rule, that their real motion is inconspicuous. We are too grateful for the sunshine and the trees after so many years of gloom to quibble about this topsy-turvy condition. 5 years in the open has taught us much about nature in reverse. There is not so much difference as one would suppose. It took us a long time to notice that the sun rose in the west and sank in the east. Summer follows winter, as it always has. It was our first spring, or rather, the season that we have come to regard as spring, that we were really disconcerted. The trees were bare, the skies cloudy, and the weather cool. We could not know at first sight whether we had emerged into spring or fall. The ground was wet, and gradually white patches of snow were forming. Soon the snow covered everything. The sky darkened, and the snow began to flurry, drifting and swirling upward, out of sight. Later we saw the ground covered with dead leaves, so we thought it must be fall. Then a few of the trees were seen to have leaves, then all. Soon the forests were in the full glory of red and brown autumn leaves. But in a few weeks, those colors turned gradually through oranges and yellows to dark greens, and we were in full summer. Our fall, which succeeded the summer, was almost normal, except toward the end, when the leaves brightened into paler greens, dwindled little by little to mere buds and then disappeared within the trees. The passage of a troop train, its windows crowded with campaign-hatted heads and waving arms, tells us another war has begun, or more properly, ended. The soldiers are returning from Cuba. Our wars, in this backward way by which we approach and end in anxiety, more nostalgia. I finished that war as a major. I keep looking eagerly at the throngs on the platforms of the railroad stations as we sweep by them, hoping to sight a familiar face among the yellow-legged cavalry. More than 80 years ago it was, as I reckon it, 40 years of it spent on the road to senility, and another 40 back to the prime of life. Somewhere among those blue-uniformed veterans am I, in my original phase. I cannot know just where, because my memory is vague as to the dates. I have caught myself entertaining the idea of stopping this giddy flight into the past, of getting out and finding my way to my former home. Only, if I could, I would be creating tremendous problems. There would have to be some sort of mutual accommodation between my alter ego and me. It looks impossible, and there are no precedents to guide us. Then, all my affairs have become complicated by the existence of Nell. She and I have had many talks about this strange state of affairs, but they are rarely conclusive. I think I must have overestimated her judgment a little in the beginning, but it really doesn't matter. She has developed into a stunning woman, and her quick, ready sympathy makes up for her lack in that direction. I glory particularly in her hair, which she lets down some days. It is thick and long and beautifully wavy, as hair should be. We often sit on the back platform, and she allows it to blow free in the breeze, all the time laughing at me because I adore it so. Captain Vanderdecken notices us not at all, unless in scorn. His mind, his whole being, is centered on getting back to Flushing, his Flushing that he calls Vlissingen, wherever that may be in time or space. Well, it appears that he is taking us back too, but it is backward in time for us. As for him, time seems meaningless. He is unchangeable. Not a single hair of that piratical beard has altered since that far future day of long ago when he broke our car away from the Interborough train in Queens. Perhaps he suffers from the same sort of unpleasant immortality the mythical wandering Jew is said to be afflicted with. Otherwise, why should he complain so bitterly of the curse he says is upon him? Nowadays he talks to himself much of the time, mainly about his ship. It is that which he hopes to find, since the Flushing beyond New York proved not to be the one he strove for. He says he left it cruising along a rocky coast. He has either forgotten where he left it, or it is no longer there, for we have gone to all the coastal points touched by the railroads. Each failure brings fresh storms of rage and blasphemy. Not even perpetual frustration seems to abate the man's determination or capacity for fury. That Dutchman has switched trains on us again. This one hasn't even pinched gas, nothing but coal oil. It is smoky, and it stinks. The engine is a wood burner with a balloon stack. The sparks are very bad and we cough a lot. I went last night when the Dutchman wasn't looking and took a look into the cab of the engine. There is no crew and I found the throttle closed. A few years back that would have struck me as odd, but now I have to accept it. I did mean to stop the train so I could take Nell off, but there is no way to stop it. It just goes along, I don't know how. On the way back, I met the Dutchman, shouting and swearing the way he does on the forward platform. I tried to throw him off the train. I am as big and strong as he is, and I don't see why I should put up with his overbearing ways. But when I went to grab him, my hands closed right through. The man is not real. It is strange I never noticed that before. Maybe that is why there is no way to stop the train, and why nobody ever seems to notice us. Maybe the train is not real either. I must look tomorrow and see whether it casts a shadow. Perhaps even we are not. But Nell is real. I know that. The other night we passed a depot platform where there was a political rally, a torchlight parade. They were carrying banners. Garfield for president. If we are ever to get off this train, we must do it soon. Nell says no, it would be embarrassing. I try to talk seriously to her about us, but she just laughs and kisses me and says let well enough alone. I wouldn't mind starting life over again, even if these towns do look pretty rough. But Nell says that she was brought up on a Kansas farm by a stepmother, and she would rather go on to the end and vanish if need be, than go back to it. That thing about the end troubles me a lot, and I wish she wouldn't keep mentioning it. It was only lately that I thought about it much, and it worries me more than death ever did in the old days. We know when it will be. 1860 for me, on the 3rd day of August. The last 10 years will be terrible, getting smaller, weaker, more helpless all the time, and winding up as a messy, squally baby. Why, that means I have only about 10 more years that are fit to live. When I was this young before, I had a lifetime ahead. It's not right. And now she has made a silly little vow, until birth do us part, and made me say it with her. It is too crowded in here, and it jolts awfully. Nell and I are cooped up in the front seats, and the captain stays in the back part, the quarterdeck, he calls it. Sometimes he opens the door and climbs up into the driver's seat. There is no driver, but we have a 4-horse team and they gallop all the time, day and night. The captain says we must use a stagecoach, because he has tried all the railroad tracks and none of them is right. He wants to get back to the sea he came from and to his ship. He is not afraid that it has been stolen, for he says most men are afraid of it. It is a haunted ship, it appears, and brings bad luck. We passed 2 men on horses this morning. One was going our way and met the other coming. The other fellow stopped him, and I heard him holler. They killed Custer and all his men, and the man that was going the same way we were said, "The bloodthirsty heathens. I'm going to jine." Nellie cries a lot. She's afraid of Indians. I'm not afraid of Indians. I would like to see one. I wish it was a boy with me instead of this little girl. Then we could do something. All she wants to do is play with that fool dolly. We could make some bows and arrows and shoot at the buffaloes, but she says that is wicked. I tried to get the captain to talk to me, but he won't. He just laughed and said, "Een tid kies aan voor op ship." That made me mad, talking crazy talk like that, and I told him so. "Time," he bellows, laughing like everything. "'Twill all be right in time." And he looks hard at me, showing his big teeth in his beard. 400, 500, 600 years more, it is nothing. I have all eternity, but one more on my ship, I will get there. I have sworn it. You come with me, and I will show you the sea, the great Indian Sea behind the Cape of Good Hope. Then someday, if those accursed headwinds abate, I will take you home with me to Flushing. That I will, though the devil himself, or all the... And then he went off to cursing and swearing the way he always does in his crazy Dutchman's talk. Nellie is mean to me. She is too bossy. She says she will not play unless I write in the book. She says I am supposed to write something in the book every day. There is not anything to put in the book. Same old stagecoach, same old captain, same old everything. I do not like the captain. He is crazy. In the night time he points at the stars shining through the roof of the coach and laughs. Then he gets mad and swears and curses something awful. When I get big again, I am going to kill him. I wish we could get away. I am afraid. It would be nice if we could find Mama. This terminates the legible part of the notebook. All of the writing purporting to have been done in the stagecoach is shaky, and the letters are much larger than earlier in the script. The rest of the contents is infantile scribblings or grotesque childish drawings. Some of them show feathered Indians drawing bows and shooting arrows. The very last one seems to represent a straight up and down cliff with wiggly lines at the bottom to suggest waves, and off a little way is a crude drawing of a galleon or other antique ship. This notebook, together with Mr. Dennison's hat and cane and Mrs. Herrick's handbag, were found in the derailed car that broke away from the Flushing train and plunged off the track into the meadows. The police are still maintaining a perfunctory hunt for the two missing persons, but I think the fact they brought this journal to us clearly indicates they consider the search hopeless. Personally, I really do not see of what help these notes can be. I fear that by now Mr. Dennison and Mrs. Herrick are quite inaccessible. End of Train for Flushing by Malcolm Jameson.